Whether you're fighting, healing, caregiving, treating cancer, or simply searching for hope, this space is for you. Welcome to FU Cancer, where meaningful conversations meet powerful community. I'm your host, a registered dietitian and cancer advocate, and together, we're turning challenges into connection. Check out our platform on the web at fucancer.health.
All right, welcome back to the FU Cancer Podcast. Today's episode tackles a topic that affects millions of both patients and families, diabetes and cancer, and what real-life meal planning actually looks like when you're living it. I'm joined and thrilled to be with Jasmine Westbrooks, a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and certified diabetes care and education specialist based in Raleigh, North Carolina. Jasmine is a true powerhouse in nutrition and wellness, blending clinical expertise with lived experience to help people build sustainable and realistic relationships with food. Her path into nutrition is deeply personal, shaped by seeing preventable health conditions affect her own family, which fueled a career rooted in prevention, empowerment, and cultural relevance. Jasmine holds a Bachelor of Science in Nutrition and Dietetics from the University of Tennessee and a Master's in Nutrition Education from Rosalind Franklin University. She's also the co-founder of Eat Well Exchange, which is a nonprofit dedicated to bringing diabetes prevention, culinary education, and hands-on nutrition programming to underserved communities while honoring cultural food traditions rather than erasing them. In addition to her community work, Jasmine is the CEO of Nourish Through Nutrition and a nationally recognized media dietitian with features across television, print, and digital platforms. At the heart of it all is her commitment to helping people move away from fear, confusion, and food guilt, and towards confidence, longevity, and a better quality of life. Today, we're cutting through noise and focusing on what truly matters: practical strategies, flexible meal planning, and support that meets people where they are, especially when both diabetes and cancer collide. So thank you so much for being here today, and we'll go ahead and kick it off. All right, Jasmine?
Sounds good. I'm excited.
Yeah. So from your experience, when somebody is managing diabetes and cancer, that kind of collision that we just talked about, what do you think are some of the biggest nutrition challenges that patients can face?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I feel like sometimes people don't realize it until they're in it, where it's like, oh, no, I have both of these chronic conditions, right, that are actually causing issues. And I don't know how to nourish myself because one person is saying to eat this way, or this piece of information is saying to eat that way. So it can bring up a challenge of confusion. So, really, one of the biggest challenges would be, am I eating to help manage diabetes, or am I eating to help with recovery from cancer, right? These are the types of questions that we're asked, and the goals can sometimes seem separate, but they can actually be within the same. There can be some type of synergy, and both have a very positive impact on the outcomes for you living healthy. And another one that I've seen too before is blood sugar management and then treatment side effects, like trying to navigate those worlds, because sometimes it can seem like, oh, I'm so nauseous, my taste changes, I don't want to eat, my appetite is low. Even certain medications like steroid-induced medications, or that induce your hyperglycemia, or blood sugars, typically are higher when you're on a steroid. So then it becomes, okay, what am I going to eat? Because the steroid medication is increasing my blood sugars. How do I manage what I'm eating while also having diabetes too? So those are the two most that I see often.
Yeah, and speaking of meal planning, we've heard that term a lot. Why don't you meal plan or think about meal planning? We hear that just, myself working with patients as well. Sounds great in theory, but
Yes.
from your experience, what tends to break down when people really try to apply it during their cancer care journey or through treatment, whether it's fatigue or these kind of high stress seasons they face?
Yeah, meal planning can be beneficial, but I think it's important to look at it from different points of view. I want to blame, just social media just a little bit on that, because sometimes we feel like our meal planning has to look a certain way. It has to be ideal for certain energy levels, but real life is not set up like that. Meal planning can definitely have its benefit, but I think it's very important to think about, what could I meal plan? And how many days can I expect it to get me through, where I may have symptoms where I have to then pivot right? And you oftentimes have to have a plan for pivoting, almost like an A, B, and C and D plan, when it comes to meal planning. And sometimes, when we look at social media or we think about meal planning perfectly, which nothing can be done perfectly, we don't make those, I guess, avenues to be able to pivot. I know fatigue makes cooking too very hard. If you're exhausted, if you're tired from seeing lots of doctor's appointments that day, that's going to make it difficult to meal plan or even just make a decision of, am I eating a balanced meal? Like that can be exhausting and confusing sometimes. Stress hormones go up when that happens. Medications also affect the blood sugars, just regardless of what food you eat. And then your appetite too can change day to day. I tell my husband all the time, like, yeah, we can have these leftovers, but a couple of days because I actually may want to taste something else or have the feel for something else to eat. And that is completely normal. And so rigid plans are not really the way to go. It actually, in a sense, increase your guilt around not eating the food, knowing that you need it for strength. And then you fall off and then you don't feel great because you feel like your meal planning was a failure. But actually, in hindsight, you can benefit from that and think about, okay, maybe I need to make more flexible approaches to eating in order to not only manage diabetes, but to really get through a journey that you're on with the symptoms of, going through cancer treatment.
I love that. So how would you say, and how do you recommend patients balance blood sugar control, especially those, whether they're high risk of developing diabetes, they're living with diabetes, with also maintaining their body weight, their muscle, their strength, and energy levels during active cancer treatments?
Yeah, in this case, it's definitely going to be a lot more about stability over strict control. I think when we think about eating healthy, we automatically think of a diet and it has to be controlled. Everything has to be perfect. And so we have to let that go. Some things that you can probably implement too is how can I prioritize some protein and carbohydrates together? That's going to actually support your muscle, your glucose control, right? And when we think of protein, it could be fish, it can be chicken, it could be beef, it can be all these different types of proteins, but don't forget about those plant-based proteins too that can actually be beneficial, whether it's edamame, whether it's different types of nuts and seeds. Then, carbohydrates is one of those that I think gets a lot of slack sometimes, but it's important to have those carbohydrates because they have their purpose, and having them together, marrying protein and carbohydrates together is the perfect partner pair. Sometimes too, it's not even about the balance. It's about, not having an appetite. So small, frequent meals are going to be important. Having those snacks, even if you have to set an alarm on your phone or remind your accountability partner to remind you to eat every 2 to 3 hours if possible. And then also accepting that sometimes your glucose levels are just going to be a little bit higher because there's so many other elements that are impacting your glucose levels during this time of your life. And because again, stability, strength, all those are still important throughout this process for you. And then the last thing I kind of think about too is hydration. Are you drinking enough water? Are we getting enough calories? Not drinking too much water where we all of a sudden are not hungry, but getting the right amount of water that our bodies naturally need. That's going to be really important too.
Awesome. So thinking from like multi-layers almost approach of where am I at now, what makes sense for me in my own kind of cancer journey, and
Yeah,
knowing that it may not look exactly what we had hoped to or like textbook perfect.
absolutely.
And we hear a lot of terms and we see on labels or packaging or people use the term like diabetes friendly or things like cancer friendly diets, right? In quotations I use. So what would you say from a myth or an oversimplified message when you see these things like this is diabetes friendly, and what's kind of your take on that?
Yeah, the most frequent one I see, and for me, I love to get into discussions and debates about it with people, even other healthcare professionals, is that carbohydrates are the enemy, like, oh, you can't have carbs, very low carb is a way to go. And if we're honest, carbohydrates have a huge benefit to our bodies. And so carbohydrates are the enemy is definitely one myth that I wish would, just not happen. People will not say it. And that's dangerous for people who really need energy, who need strength. And
Sure.
so if you're eating certain, food groups and you don't feel yourself getting energy because you're not eating carbohydrates, oftentimes that can be a quick fix. So that's definitely one that I wish would just people would let go mentally and physically and just enjoy, sources of carbohydrates, but also educating themselves on what carbohydrates are because there's a lot of confusion about that too that I find where I have people that say, "Oh, I don't eat carbohydrates," and then they start naming what they eat and I'm like, "Okay, so just to let you know that those are carbohydrates, but no need to panic because they have a function." So, yeah, let's let that one go.
Yeah, I love that. And so, with people really conflicted by all this nutrition advice, you go online, you can see, type in, and you get five different responses to the same question. It can get really confusing for people, especially cancer population, where there's so many nutrients that are deemed as, cancer promoting and all these different things that can just feel really overwhelming. What's the first place you recommend people start with? If not, a group of professionals, a society, do you have any good recommendations for nutrition advice?
The dietitian, I have to toot for us. Like, we are the experts in food and nutrition, right? And not only that, I know sometimes being the expert can seem overwhelming to a person that is not the expert. But I want you to think of it this way, like, dietitians, we make it personable for you. Right. And so we have appointments with you to get to know you, not only just foods that you like, but what's your schedule like? What's your stress level like? Because that may be impacting what you eat. What is your culture and what are some cultural foods that you like to eat? What are social environments like with you in food? So those are the key things that I think people don't really look at, but a dietitian can be, the driving force to help around that. And even better, it's helpful when you have a dietitian that's also able to work with other healthcare professionals that you're seeing. So even if made a quick recommendation to your doctor and say, "Hey, I've been seeing this dietitian, I think you all should talk because she's amazing." Being the cheerleader for us in certain spaces can also help bring that interprofessional team together for you that's going to, create better outcomes for you as well.
So if patients, as far as, patients on their own cancer journeys have not seen a dietitian, that might be an opportunity for them to explore that. Somebody especially that has experience like you in diabetes management, of being really expert in that space. And you also mentioned cultural foods, which are so important. I live in Southern California. It's a melting pot out here. I love it. And it's so deeply personal, right? That we're eating foods that are meaningful. So how do you help individuals adapt traditional meals and kind of this diabetes meal planning method, if you will, without losing their identity or joy or just connection to food?
Yes, that's a very good question because our cultural foods, by the way, are healthy, explanation mark. There are so many different amazing foods from different cultures, and culture oftentimes is not the problem. Sometimes it's access, sometimes it's true balance of what to eat, sometimes it's lack of education and mirroring all those together. So what I typically do is I start with people where they are, number one. What do they have access to? What's easy for them based on their lifestyle, what they already eat. Because sometimes I think people assume that a dietitian, "Oh, I need you to just have a meal plan ready for me." But on that meal plan, if there's no cultural foods or foods that you often eat that aren't on the list, then you're going to feel limited and you're going to feel like it's a true diet. And part of that is some people lose their identity too, because culture is our identity. Sometimes it's just about adjusting portions of certain foods on a plate, if it's in a saucer. There's so many different unique cultures and different types of foods that we eat, even sometimes the cooking methods, the timing of certain meals. So it varies. It depends on where they are. A very authentic conversation with my clients to really understand where they're coming from when it comes to their food practices. And then also honoring food as a memory, explaining to people or understanding that food can either be a comfort for some, a connection. For some, it can be trauma, right? And so there's so many different elements to it that I think as a dietitian, it's for me to investigate and really have those conversations with each client that I see to be able to give that personalized individual experience.
I love that. And I think that goes off of, thinking about, and you've talked a lot about flexibility in the diet pattern and kind of meeting the needs in the present. So, speaking of flexibility, what role do you think it plays in long-term success in things like diabetes management, especially somebody who's going through cancer treatment or into their road of survivorship?
Yeah, that's a good one because flexibility oftentimes we think of flexibility because sometimes it's a plan B option that, oh, I failed, right? And so we have to switch that mindset. It isn't failure, it's just you finding out what works for you during this time in your life. And so our bodies change. When you go through certain treatment processes, your bodies will change. And so if your body's changing, then that means your needs are going to change, and you have to adjust in that flexibility too. What works also during chemo may change during recovery. So knowing how to transition from those steps too can be a lot, but I think it helps when you have support and understand that that's part of the long-term success that you made it through. And now it's time to figure out how to, recover in a way that's healthy. And then also too, because a lot of people don't understand how change can oftentimes bring a change in your mental health. Right. And that's important as well. Your mental health, food relationships that you have that may have changed as going through this journey. I think it's important to have an assessment of that as well.
Yeah, yeah. And we've talked a lot about kind of like from the patient lens of different things going through kind of their own cancer journey. I'd love to hear from the caregiver lens, kind of flipping roles a little bit. Arguably, the caregiver really providing potentially in cooking and being the one in the kitchen for some people, kind of 100% of the time. How can caregivers realistically support meal planning, especially when it goes back to diabetes management or supporting blood glucose or those blood sugar controls?
Absolutely. And thank you to all our caregivers, first of all, because it's
Yeah.
not an easy journey,
No.
right? But it's so important to think about support over control because there is a difference. And I think it's very important for the person that you're caring for to talk to the person to see how they can support. Because we may assume that supporting someone is saying, don't eat those cookies, right? But that person may not need that day. And so it's even more important for the person who's going through that journey to tell the caregiver how they can support, very detailed of how they can do it. Some choices that I'm kind of thinking about right now is just offering choices instead of demands, focusing solely on nourishment, not numbers. How can I help the person that I'm caring for to be more nourished? Period, right? Sharing meals when possible, maybe meal ideas, maybe making this time together where you can look at different meals that you all could make, maybe testing them out, having food tasting sessions together. I mean, there are ways that you can do it where someone can feel supportive. And caregivers, guess what? You all need rest too. As much as we appreciate you all,
Yeah.
you definitely need rest. And you want to give yourself permission to rest and also show yourself some compassion in the process, especially if it's your first time being a caregiver.
I love the compassion in the process and reminding ourselves that our caregivers also need to be nourished and all these things too. So you can't caregive if you're out of fuel. So, kind of to wrap up today, if someone listening could change just one thing about how they approach food this week coming up, what mindset shift would matter most, or what recommendations do you have?
Yeah, I think that food doesn't have to be perfect. We live in a world right now where perfection, people will assume that someone's perfect and they're not. Food is so many different things to so many different people, but one thing that never fails is that food is powerful and food is something that we need. And so I would tell the person that's listening now that give yourself grace in the food choices that you're making and just take it one day at a time.
I love that. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jasmine, for bringing compassion truly and real world experience kind of in the diabetes management space to a conversation that I think a lot of people tend to navigate quietly, or a space that feels very uncertain for many without a lot of good support resources available. And to our listeners, if you're managing diabetes, cancer, or both, or caring for somebody that is, remember, as Jasmine kind of just alluded to, that there's no perfect plate. There's no such thing as a perfect meal plan for diabetes management. That's it for today's episode of the FU Cancer podcast. Until next time, I'm Shelby Yaceczko, the founder of FU Cancer, and thanks so much for listening.
The conversation doesn't end here. Join our community today at fucancer.health for trusted education, real community, and resources. We're here for you every step of the way.